Welcome back to Dramatic History. In the last part, Eleanor's life changed because of one unexpected choice. But just days before her wedding to the Duke, an old mystery returned. The mystery of Margaret. And if you haven't watched part 1 yet, you can find it here on our channel. I strongly recommend watching it first, because tonight's story continues from exactly where we left off. Eleanor still doesn't know how deeply her own past is connected to the dark secrets surrounding the Wexford family. So, without saying too much, let's return to that night, just before everything began to change. The room had gone completely still. For several seconds, Eleanor could hear nothing except the rain. It struck the tall windows in soft, irregular patterns, tapping against the glass like impatient fingers that had come searching for someone. Beyond the windows, London had disappeared beneath a curtain of darkness. The candles along the walls had burned low. Their flames trembled whenever the wind slipped through the old window frames, sending delicate shadows across the portraits hanging above the fireplace. Richard was still standing beside her. Neither of them had moved. Neither seemed capable of doing so. Between them lay the small silver locket. Its surface was cold, old, almost blackened with age. Richard had found it only moments earlier in the abandoned west wing of Wexford House. Inside it was the faded portrait of Margaret. And beneath Margaret's portrait, a second image, a child, a little girl with dark hair and unusually clear eyes. Eyes that Eleanor had seen every morning when she looked into her own mirror. She reached toward the locket. Her fingers stopped before touching it. Richard, her voice barely existed. He looked at her. Eleanor, what does this mean? He did not answer. She looked down again. The tiny photograph seemed almost impossible. Perhaps the light was playing tricks. Perhaps exhaustion had altered her perception. Perhaps the face simply resembled hers. That was all. It had to be. Let me see it. Richard handed her the locket. She held it close to the candle. The child's face became clearer. A small oval face, dark hair, soft cheeks, and those eyes. Eleanor's breath caught. She knew those eyes. She had inherited them from her mother. At least, that was what she had always been told. Her mother had died when Eleanor was very young. There were only a handful of memories left. A woman's perfume, a soft voice, a hand brushing through her hair, and those eyes. Eleanor closed the locket. Where did this come from? Richard shook his head. I don't know, but it was here. Yes, in Margaret's room. Yes. Then Margaret knew something about me. Richard looked toward the dark corridor. Perhaps. No. Eleanor's voice became firmer. Not perhaps. She held up the locket. Someone left this here for us to find. Richard looked at her. Why? I don't know. Then we shouldn't assume. She turned toward him. Someone knew I would come here. Richard stepped closer. Eleanor, think about it. Her hands were trembling now. The letter appeared. Richard nodded. Then the receipt. Another nod. And now this. She opened the locket again. That is too many coincidences. Richard's jaw tightened. No. What? He looked at her. You're right. The words were quiet. There is no coincidence anymore. They returned to the library. Richard locked the door behind them. Eleanor sat near the fire. She could not feel the warmth. Her mind was moving too quickly. Richard placed the locket on the desk, then the old receipt, then the photograph, 3 pieces of a story that neither of them understood. He stood with both hands resting against the desk. We need to be careful. Eleanor looked at him. Why? Because whoever sent the letter knew something about Margaret, and they also knew about you. She swallowed. Yes. Richard looked toward the window. That means this isn't simply about the past. Eleanor watched him. It is about us. He turned. Yes. Silence. Then Eleanor asked, who knew my birthday? Richard's eyes narrowed. Your family. My sisters. Perhaps. Your family. Possibly. Who else? Richard had no answer. Eleanor looked down at her hands. Her engagement ring caught the candlelight. A beautiful thing. A promise. Only a few days ago, she had looked at it and felt nothing but happiness. Now it seemed almost unbearably heavy. What if someone doesn't want us to marry? Richard walked toward her. Then they should have told me directly. They may not be willing to. Why? Because perhaps they know you would not listen. He smiled faintly. That is possible. She looked at him. You are not frightened. I am. You don't look it. I learned a long time ago not to show fear. Eleanor studied his face. Because of Margaret? He looked away. Partly. She reached for his hand. He let her take it. I wish you had told me sooner. I know. I could have understood. I know. Then why? Richard lowered himself into the chair beside her. Because every time I remembered Margaret, I remembered how powerless I was. Eleanor said nothing. He continued. I was 16. His eyes remained fixed on the fire. I thought adults knew everything. A faint, bitter smile crossed his lips. I believed that if something terrible happened, someone older would explain it. He paused. No one did. Eleanor's fingers tightened around his. What did you do? Nothing. His voice was almost a whisper. I watched everyone tell me that I had imagined things, and you believed them. For a while. Then, I stopped believing. He looked at her, but by then it was too late. The next morning, Eleanor woke before sunrise. She had slept perhaps 2 hours. Her mind had refused to quiet. She dressed herself. She did not call for a maid. She wanted silence. The house was still asleep. She walked downstairs. The long corridors were dim. Only a few candles burned. She entered the library. The locket was still on the desk. She opened it. The child's face stared back at her. Eleanor studied it again. This time, she noticed something she had missed. There was a tiny mark beneath the photograph. A letter. Not an initial. A symbol. A small crescent-shaped engraving. She touched it, then remembered something. Her mother's old jewelry box. There had been a similar symbol. She had seen it only once. When she was perhaps 8 years old, her mother had owned a small silver brooch. Eleanor remembered the shape, a crescent, and beneath it, 3 tiny stars. She stood abruptly. She needed to return to Ashcombe immediately. But before she could leave the room, a voice came from behind her. You should not be looking at that. Eleanor froze. She turned. The Duchess of Wexford stood in the doorway. Her face was expressionless. Eleanor slowly closed the locket. Your Grace. The Duchess looked at it. Where did you find that? In the West Wing. The Duchess took a breath. Give it to me. Eleanor did not move. Why? Because it belongs to this family. So does the truth. The Duchess's eyes hardened. You don't know what you are asking. Then tell me. I cannot, or you will not. The Duchess stepped into the room. Miss Harrow, there are things about old families that are better left untouched. Eleanor stared at her. Is that what you told Richard? The Duchess stopped. Eleanor continued. When Margaret died, for the first time, something flickered across the older woman's face. Fear. It was gone almost immediately. But Eleanor had seen it. You have been speaking to my son. Yes. About Margaret? Yes. The Duchess's expression became cold again. You should stop. Why? Because you are approaching a truth that has destroyed everyone who touched it. Eleanor felt a chill. Everyone. The Duchess did not answer. Your Grace. The older woman turned. Before leaving, she said quietly, Go home. Eleanor stared after her. Why? The Duchess stopped at the door. Because your wedding is only days away. She looked back. And some marriages should never happen. Then she walked away. Eleanor remained completely still. Richard found her 20 minutes later. He knew immediately something had happened. What did my mother say? Eleanor looked at him. She told me to go home. His expression darkened. Why? Because of Margaret. He closed the library door. What exactly did she say? Eleanor repeated the conversation. Richard listened without interruption. When she finished, he stood silently for several seconds. Then he walked to the fireplace. My mother knew. Eleanor looked at him. You believe she did? I always suspected. Then why didn't you ask her? Because I knew she would lie. And now? Richard turned. Now I think she is frightened. Eleanor stepped closer. Of whom? I don't know. Could she have sent the letter? No. How do you know? Because my mother would never warn us. Eleanor frowned. What would she do? She would destroy the evidence. Silence. That answer frightened Eleanor more than anything else. Richard approached the desk. He picked up the receipt. Someone else wants us to know. Who? I don't know. He looked at the old paper. But I intend to find out. By afternoon, Eleanor had made her decision. She was going back to Ashcombe Hall. Not to leave Richard, not to end the engagement, but to search for the crescent symbol. She remembered her mother's jewelry box. If it still existed, perhaps there would be an answer. Richard insisted on accompanying her. The journey would take several hours. They left London before sunset. The countryside passed slowly beyond the carriage windows. For a long time, neither spoke. Finally, Eleanor said, "Do you remember the first time you saw me?" Richard smiled. "At the tea table. You looked annoyed." "I was." "At me?" "No." "Then who?" "My mother." Eleanor smiled. "You were watching me." "I was." "Why?" Richard looked at her. "Because everyone else in the room was trying to impress me." He paused. "You weren't. I was trying not to spill the tea." "I know." She laughed softly. Then her expression became serious. "Would you have chosen me if you had known all this?" Richard did not hesitate. "Yes." "Even if my past is connected to yours?" "Yes." "Even if your family knew something about me?" "Yes." "Even if this ruins everything?" He took her hand. "Eleanor." She looked at him. "I chose you before I knew any of this." His voice softened. "And I would choose you again." She looked out the window. Tears gathered in her eyes. She quickly wiped them away. Richard pretended not to notice. That was one of the reasons she loved him. He knew when silence was kinder. Ashcombe Hall looked different when they arrived. Perhaps because Eleanor had changed. The house had always been home. Now it seemed like a locked box, full of things she had never thought to question. Charlotte was waiting in the entrance hall. She rushed toward Eleanor. "What happened?" Eleanor hugged her. "Everything." Charlotte looked at Richard. His expression was serious. "That sounds promising." Eleanor almost laughed. "We need Mother's things." Charlotte frowned. "Why?" "The jewelry box." Charlotte's face changed. "You remember it?" "Yes." "Why?" Eleanor looked at her. "The crescent." Charlotte went pale. "What crescent?" "The symbol on Mother's brooch." Charlotte said nothing. Eleanor grabbed her hand. "Charlotte, I thought you had forgotten." "Forgotten what?" Charlotte looked toward Richard, then lowered her voice. "Mother didn't own that brooch." Eleanor stared. "What?" "She borrowed it." "From whom?" Charlotte swallowed. "Lady Margaret." The room became silent. Eleanor felt as though the floor had moved beneath her. Richard stepped forward. "You knew." "I was 11. I was 11. Her voice trembled. "I didn't understand. What happened?" Charlotte looked at Eleanor. "Mother told me never to speak about it." Eleanor's breathing became shallow. "When did Margaret give her the brooch?" Charlotte shook her head. "She didn't." "Then who did?" Charlotte looked toward the staircase. "Father." Eleanor froze. Her father, a man she had spent years believing had been distant but honorable, a man whose memory she had protected, a man who had died without ever explaining why her mother had disappeared from her life. Charlotte whispered, "Father brought the brooch home 3 weeks before you were born." Eleanor stared at her. 3 weeks? Charlotte nodded. "He told Mother that it was a family heirloom." Richard's face had become completely still. Eleanor whispered, "Then why did Margaret's locket have the same symbol?" Charlotte had no answer. Richard did. Because they were connected. Everyone turned toward him. He looked at Eleanor. "Your father may have known Margaret." Eleanor shook her head. "No." "Why not?" "Because my father would never." She stopped. The sentence died in her mouth. Because she suddenly remembered something. A memory from childhood. A locked study. Her father's voice. And another voice behind the door. A woman's voice. Soft. Frightened. Eleanor had forgotten it for years. Until now. She whispered, "I heard someone." Richard stepped closer. "When?" "When I was little." "What did you hear?" "I don't remember." "Try." Eleanor closed her eyes. The memory came slowly. A corridor. Rain against windows. Her father's study. A woman's voice. And then, a name. Eleanor opened her eyes. "Margaret." Charlotte covered her mouth. Richard stared at her. You heard Margaret? I think so. You were a child. I know. But she died before you were born. Eleanor looked at him. No. The room fell silent. I heard her after I was born. Richard's face changed. Eleanor's voice trembled. She was in my father's study. And for the first time, Richard understood that the mystery was no longer simply about the Duke's past. It had crossed into Eleanor's childhood, into her family, into the very house where she had been raised. And somewhere inside Ashcombe Hall, the answer to Eleanor's birth had been waiting all these years. But before they could search for it, someone upstairs screamed. The scream came from upstairs. It was short, sharp, and then it stopped. For one terrible second, no one moved. Eleanor looked at Charlotte. Charlotte looked at Richard. Richard was already walking toward the staircase. Stay here. Eleanor followed him. No. He turned. Eleanor, I'm coming with you. There was something in her voice that made him stop arguing. They climbed the stairs together. The old house seemed to have changed in the few seconds since the scream. The corridors felt narrower. The air felt colder. Even the servants, who had begun appearing from their rooms, seemed reluctant to speak. A maid stood halfway along the landing. Her face was pale. Richard approached her. What happened? She pointed toward the end of the corridor. I heard someone. Who? I don't know. What did you see? The maid swallowed. A woman. Eleanor's heart stopped. Where? The maid pointed toward an old sitting room. Inside. Richard immediately crossed the corridor. The door was open. He entered. Eleanor followed. The room was empty. There was a small table near the window, 2 chairs, a cold fireplace, and a vase of dried roses. Nothing else. Richard searched behind the curtains, then the adjoining room. Nothing. Eleanor remained near the doorway. Something caught her attention. One of the chairs had been moved, only slightly, but enough to leave a clean mark in the dust beneath its legs. She stepped closer. Richard, he turned. What? Someone was sitting here. He looked down. She was right. The dust had been disturbed. Recently. Richard's expression hardened. Who? Eleanor looked toward the window. The rain had stopped. The glass was fogged from the warmth inside the room. But there was something written on it. A single word. Eleanor. She stopped breathing. Richard saw it too. Neither spoke. The letters had been traced into the condensation with a finger. Eleanor. Someone had written her name. Not recently. Not by accident. Deliberately. Richard walked toward the window. His fingers hovered over the writing. Someone knew you were coming. Eleanor stared at her own name. How? I don't know. Richard. She touched the glass. The letters were already beginning to disappear. I think whoever is doing this wants me to find something, or wants you to believe something. She turned. What if those are the same thing? Richard did not answer. They searched the house until midnight. Every bedroom, every corridor, every unused room. Nothing. No stranger, no hidden passage, no open door, no trace of whoever had written Eleanor's name. Eventually, Charlotte insisted they stop. You cannot search the entire house all night. Richard looked at her. Someone entered this house. No. Charlotte nodded. I know. And they knew Eleanor's name. I know. He looked at Eleanor. That is why we cannot simply ignore it. Eleanor was standing beside the staircase. Her attention was elsewhere. She was looking at the portrait hanging above the landing. Her father's portrait. He stood there in a dark formal coat, one hand resting against the back of a chair. He looked exactly as Eleanor remembered him, severe, controlled, almost impossible to read. She had spent years believing she understood him. Now she was no longer certain. She walked toward the portrait. There was something beneath the frame, a small brass plate. She had never noticed it before. She wiped away the dust. 3 words were engraved into it. Ashcombe, 1847, Wexford. Eleanor stared. Richard came beside her. What is it? She pointed. He read it. His face became still. My family crest. Why would it be here? I don't know. Charlotte approached slowly. She looked at the engraving, then at Eleanor. There's something else. What? Charlotte pointed behind the portrait. A small metal hook was visible. Richard removed the painting from the wall. Behind it was a narrow compartment, hidden inside the wall. Eleanor's heart began pounding. Richard reached inside. His fingers touched something. He pulled it out, a small wooden box. It was old, darkened with age. The lock had already been broken. Richard opened it. Inside were papers, several letters, a silver brooch, and a small leather-bound journal. Eleanor recognized the brooch immediately. The crescent, 3 tiny stars beneath it. She reached for it. Her fingers trembled. "This is Mother's." Charlotte shook her head. "No." Eleanor looked at her. "It isn't." Charlotte's voice was quiet. "It belonged to Margaret." Richard picked up the brooch. He turned it over. On the back was a tiny inscription. M.A. Margaret Ashford. Eleanor stared. "Then why did my father have it?" No one answered. Richard opened the journal. The first pages were blank. Then he found a date. 15 years earlier. He read silently. Eleanor watched his face. "What does it say?" Richard hesitated, then handed it to her. The entry was written in her father's handwriting. "I have done what was necessary." Eleanor continued. "There are some debts a man cannot escape." Her fingers tightened around the page. The next line was worse. "Margaret has agreed to disappear." Eleanor looked up. Richard was staring at her. "She agreed?" Eleanor kept reading. "She understands that the child must never know." The room seemed to lose all warmth. "The child." Eleanor looked at Richard. "Me." He said nothing. She turned the page. Several lines had been torn away. The next, surviving entry was dated 3 weeks later. "The girl has been born." Eleanor's hand began shaking. Her mother must leave before anyone discovers the truth. She could not breathe. Charlotte whispered, "Mother." Eleanor turned the page. The final sentence was barely visible. "If Margaret returns, everything will be lost." The journal slipped from Eleanor's fingers. It struck the floor. Nobody moved. Richard bent down and picked it up. He looked at Eleanor. "Eleanor." She shook her head. "No." She backed away. "No, this cannot be true." Richard stepped toward her. "Listen to me. My father knew Margaret. Yes. He knew about me. Yes. My mother left because of her. I don't know. But the journal says. It says she had to leave. Why?" Richard had no answer. Eleanor looked at the letters inside the box. "Read them." Richard opened the first. It was addressed to Eleanor's father. The handwriting was elegant, feminine, familiar. "Margaret, you promised me she would be safe." Richard looked at Eleanor. She nodded. "Continue." He read, "You promised no one would ever tell her." The next sentence was partly damaged. "But I cannot remain away forever." Another line. "She deserves to know who her mother is." Eleanor closed her eyes. Her chest tightened. Her mother. All these years she had believed her mother was gone, dead, lost, or perhaps simply incapable of loving her. But now another possibility stood before her. Her mother might have left willingly, or perhaps she had been forced to leave, and Margaret knew why. Richard turned the page. The final letter was dated just days before Eleanor's birth. "If you truly intend to protect the child, send her away from Wexford. Do not let her marry into your family." Eleanor's eyes moved over the words. She stopped. "Marry into your family." Richard read it again. His face changed. The letter continued. "Because if she ever becomes your son's wife, the truth will return with her." Silence. Eleanor slowly looked at Richard. She knew. "Yes, she knew I would marry you." Richard shook his head. "No, but she wrote." She knew it was possible. Eleanor stared at him. "Why?" Richard looked at the date, then at her. "Because my father had already made arrangements." "What arrangements?" "I don't know. Then we find out." The following morning, Richard sent a message to Surrey. He needed the old solicitor's records, every document his father had left behind. Every letter, every account, every private correspondence. Nothing could be ignored. Eleanor remained at Ashcombe Hall. She barely ate. She barely slept. She spent hours reading the journal. Most of it contained ordinary financial matters. Land, tenants, estate repairs, political correspondence. But every few pages, there was something about Margaret. And every mention seemed to become more urgent. One entry caught Eleanor's attention. It was dated 6 months before her birth. "She refuses to leave." Another. Margaret believes the danger has passed. Another. I have told her the truth. And then, months later, she knows now. Eleanor stopped. She read it again. She knows now. But what did Margaret know? What truth had Eleanor's father revealed? And why had it been important enough to separate Margaret from everyone she knew? She turned another page. Nothing. Several pages had been removed, carefully. Not torn, cut. Someone had taken them. Eleanor ran her finger along the edge. Whoever had removed them had done it deliberately. She looked toward the door. Charlotte was standing there. You've been awake all night. Eleanor closed the journal. So have you. Charlotte entered. She sat beside her. I remember something. Eleanor looked at her. About Margaret. Charlotte nodded. About the night you were born. Eleanor became still. What do you remember? Mother was crying. Why? I don't know. Where was father? With her. Was Margaret there? Charlotte looked down. I don't know. Charlotte, I was a child. I know. But I remember someone leaving. Who? A woman. Eleanor's heart raced. What did she look like? I couldn't see her face. Why? She wore a veil. Eleanor looked at her. Where did she go? Through the back entrance. When? The night you were born. Eleanor whispered. Then she could have been my mother. Charlotte nodded slowly. Perhaps. The word felt unbearable. Eleanor stood. She walked toward the window. Outside, the gardens were wet from the previous night's rain. She remembered her childhood. She remembered waiting for someone who never came. She remembered asking her father why her mother had gone. He had always said the same thing. Some people leave because they have no choice. At the time, Eleanor had assumed he meant death. Now she wondered if he had meant something else. That afternoon, Richard returned. He looked exhausted. Eleanor met him in the library. What did you find? He placed a leather folder on the desk. The solicitor sent these. She opened it. Inside were estate records, private correspondence, and one sealed envelope. Richard looked at it. It was addressed to me. By your father? He nodded. Why did you never receive it? It was hidden among documents the solicitor believed were irrelevant. Eleanor looked at the seal. Open it. Richard broke it. Inside was a single sheet. He read it, then read it again. What does it say? Richard handed it to Eleanor. She read, My son, if you are reading this, then the past has returned. I have failed to protect you from it. There is a woman you must never trust. Eleanor looked at Richard. Who? He continued reading. She will appear harmless. She will speak softly. She will tell you that she wants to help. Do not believe her. Eleanor's eyes moved down the page, then stopped. The final sentence was written in darker ink. She is the reason Margaret disappeared. Richard looked at Eleanor. Who is she? Eleanor shook her head. I don't know. Then she noticed something. A small mark beneath the final sentence, the same crescent, 3 stars. Her stomach tightened. Richard. He looked. What? She pointed. The symbol. His face changed. The same mark had appeared on the locket, the brooch, the hidden compartment, and now the letter. Richard whispered, That isn't my family's crest. What is it? I don't know, but your father knew, apparently. Eleanor looked at the symbol. Then someone else must know too. That evening, a visitor arrived, an elderly woman. She gave no name. She simply told the servant she had come to see Eleanor. The servant hesitated, but the woman insisted. Eleanor entered the drawing room. The stranger stood beside the window. She wore a dark gray dress. A black veil covered most of her face. Eleanor stopped. The woman turned. For a moment, neither spoke. Then the woman said, You look like her. Eleanor's heart stopped. Who? The woman smiled sadly. Your mother. Eleanor stepped forward. How do you know my mother? The woman looked toward the door. Because I was there. When? The night you were born. Eleanor could barely speak. What happened? The woman lowered her voice. Your mother wanted to stay. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. Why didn't she? She was told she would lose you if she stayed. Who told her? The woman did not answer. Who? The woman looked directly into Eleanor's eyes. Your father. Eleanor froze. No. He believed he was protecting you. From what? The woman looked away. From the Wexfords. Eleanor's breath caught. But why? Because your father knew what they had done. What had they done? The woman stepped closer. Before she could answer, footsteps sounded in the hallway. Richard. The woman immediately moved toward the door. Eleanor grabbed her arm. Wait, the woman whispered. You must not marry him. Eleanor stared. Why? Because the moment you become Duchess of Wexford, she paused, they will have the power to make you disappear too. Then she pulled free. The door opened. Richard entered. The woman was gone. Only the curtains moved beside the open window. Richard looked at Eleanor. What happened? She could barely breathe. Someone was here. Who? Eleanor looked toward the window. I don't know. Richard crossed the room. Did she say anything? Eleanor hesitated, then whispered. She told me not to marry you. Richard stopped. Why? Eleanor looked at him. Because your family might make me disappear. Richard's face went cold. He turned toward the window. Then he noticed something on the floor. A small piece of black fabric. He picked it up. It smelled faintly of lavender. Eleanor stared at it. She knew that scent. It was the same perfume she remembered from childhood. Her mother's perfume. Richard looked at her. Eleanor. She shook her head. No. But the tears had already begun falling. Because for the first time in her life, she had a reason to believe her mother might still be alive. And somewhere beyond the walls of Ashcombe Hall, someone was watching the house. Someone who had been waiting 15 years for Eleanor to discover the truth. Someone who knew that the wedding was only days away. And someone who now understood that Eleanor and Richard were getting dangerously close to the secret. The next morning, another letter would arrive. This one would contain no warning, no explanation, only a name Eleanor had never heard before. A name that would lead them directly to the one place where Margaret had last been seen alive. And when Eleanor finally saw that name, she would realize that the woman in the veil had not come to stop the wedding. She had come to make sure Eleanor survived it. The following morning arrived beneath a sky the color of old silver. A thin mist rested over the gardens of Ashcombe Hall, softening the bare branches and turning the distant fields into pale shadows. The house itself seemed unusually quiet, not peaceful, quiet. There was a difference. Peace invited a person to rest, silence invited them to listen, and Eleanor had spent most of the night listening. She had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the woman standing beside the drawing-room window, the dark veil, the trembling voice, the warning. Do not marry him, and then those words that refused to leave her mind. Your mother wanted to stay. Eleanor had spent half her life believing that her mother had abandoned her. Now, for the first time, she wondered whether that belief had been placed inside her deliberately. Perhaps the greatest lie of her childhood had not been that her mother was dead. Perhaps it had been that her mother had chosen to leave. Eleanor stood beside the window of her bedroom, watching the mist move slowly across the lawn. Her mother's perfume still seemed to linger in her memory. Lavender. A soft, almost sweet scent. She had not thought about it in years, until the woman in the veil. Eleanor touched the edge of her dressing gown. Her hands were cold. A quiet knock came at the door. Come in. Charlotte entered. She carried a tray with tea. Eleanor turned. You should still be asleep. So should you. Charlotte placed the tray on the small table. Tea. Eleanor nodded. Charlotte poured. The sound of the liquid filling the porcelain cup was strangely comforting. For a few moments, neither woman spoke. Then Charlotte said quietly, Do you believe her? Eleanor looked at the tea. I don't know. About Mother? I want to. Charlotte sat opposite her. But wanting something to be true doesn't make it true. Charlotte lowered her eyes. You've changed. Eleanor looked at her. Have I? You used to accept things. I was younger. You trusted Father. I was a child. Charlotte sighed. And now? Eleanor lifted the cup. Now I think everyone has been lying. Charlotte looked toward the window. Perhaps they believed they were protecting us. Eleanor's expression hardened. Protection that requires lies is still a prison. Charlotte said nothing. Eleanor took a small sip of tea. Then she noticed something. There was a folded piece of paper beneath the saucer. She stared at it. I didn't put that there. Charlotte looked down. Neither did I. Eleanor carefully lifted the saucer. The paper was sealed. No name, no crest, only the crescent symbol, 3 stars beneath it. Her stomach tightened. Charlotte whispered, "Don't open it." Eleanor looked at her. "I have to." She broke the seal. Inside was a single line. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the message was unmistakable. "Come to the old chapel before sunset. Come alone." Eleanor read it twice. Charlotte stood. "No." Eleanor folded the paper. "I have to go." "You cannot. If someone knows about my mother, it could be a trap." "I know. Then why would you go?" Eleanor looked at her sister. "Because if I don't, I may spend the rest of my life wondering what I could have learned." Charlotte's eyes filled with fear. "And if you do go?" Eleanor looked toward the gray morning. "Then at least I will know." Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Richard arrived before noon. He found Eleanor in the library. The journal lay open before her. She had told him everything. The letter, the woman, the message, the chapel. He listened with his arms folded. When she finished, he said only one word. "No." Eleanor looked up. "No? You are not going." "Richard, no. You don't understand." "I understand perfectly." He walked toward the desk. "You have been followed. Perhaps. You found your name written on a window." "Yes." "Someone entered this house without being seen." "Yes." "And now someone is ordering you to meet them alone." Eleanor held his gaze. "That is exactly why I need to go." Richard's expression tightened. "That is exactly why you cannot." She stood. "Then come with me." "No." "Why?" "Because they specifically said alone." "Then I will go alone." "I said no." Eleanor stared at him. "You're not my husband yet." He went silent. The words had escaped her before she could stop them. She regretted them immediately. Richard's face changed, not with anger, with hurt. Eleanor stepped closer. "I'm sorry." He looked away. "I know. I don't mean that I don't trust you. I know." "Then what?" He turned toward her. "I am afraid." Eleanor's expression softened. "Of losing me?" "Yes." She reached for his hand. "I am afraid too." He looked at her. "But fear cannot be allowed to make every decision for us." Richard took a slow breath. "Then let me come. They asked me to come alone." "Then don't tell them I came." She almost smiled. "You would hide behind a tree, if necessary." Despite everything, a quiet laugh escaped her. Richard smiled faintly. Then the smile disappeared. "I am serious. So am I." He squeezed her hand. "If you go, I will follow." Eleanor nodded. "Then we agree." Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The old chapel stood nearly a mile beyond the estate. It had been abandoned for years. The roof had collapsed in places. Ivy covered the stone walls. The wooden doors had warped from years of rain. Once, the chapel had belonged to the Ashcombe estate. Now even the servants avoided it. Eleanor remembered hearing stories as a child. A woman had disappeared there. A child had been baptized there. A funeral had been held there without a body. She had never known which story was true. Perhaps none of them. Perhaps all of them. She left just before sunset. Richard followed at a distance. The path was muddy beneath her shoes. The hem of her dark traveling dress became damp. The wind carried the scent of wet earth. Bare branches scratched against one another above her. As she approached the chapel, she saw the door standing open. Eleanor stopped. Her heart began beating faster. She looked behind her. Nothing. Richard was nowhere in sight. She stepped inside. The chapel was colder than outside. Dust covered the old wooden pews. A cracked, stained glass window allowed a thin beam of fading light to fall across the floor. At the far end stood a stone altar, and beside it, someone was waiting. The woman wore the same dark veil. Eleanor stopped several feet away. "You came. Who are you?" The woman did not answer. "You knew my mother." "Yes." "Is she alive?" A long silence. Then the woman said, "That depends on what you mean by alive." Eleanor felt a chill. What does that mean? It means your mother disappeared because she believed disappearing would save you. Save me from whom? The woman looked toward the chapel doors. From the people who believed you belonged to them. Eleanor's voice became quiet. I don't understand. You were not supposed to grow up here. Where? Anywhere but Ashcombe. Why? Because your father made a bargain. Eleanor stepped closer. What bargain? The woman reached inside her cloak. She produced an old envelope. Your father agreed to give you up. Eleanor stared at her. No, he had no choice. Everyone keeps saying that. The woman's voice softened. Because it was true. Who forced him? She looked at Eleanor. The Wexfords. Eleanor's breath caught. Why? Because your birth threatened an inheritance. She stared. What inheritance? The woman lowered her eyes. That is what you must discover. Eleanor reached for the envelope. The woman pulled it back. Not yet. Why? Because once you read it, there is no going back. Eleanor's voice trembled. There hasn't been any going back since I found that locket. The woman studied her. You really are like your mother. What does that mean? You refuse to stop asking questions. A faint smile touched the woman's lips. She was the same. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. Tell me about her. The woman looked toward the broken window. Your mother loved you. Eleanor closed her eyes. The words hurt more than she expected. Then why did she leave me? She didn't. Eleanor opened her eyes. What? She did not leave you. The chapel seemed to disappear around her. What are you saying? Your mother was taken away. By whom? The woman looked at her. Your father. Eleanor shook her head. No. He believed he was saving you. He took her away from me? He thought you would be killed if she stayed. By whom? The woman remained silent. Eleanor stepped forward. Who wanted me dead? The woman whispered. The same people who want your marriage. Eleanor's blood ran cold. What does my marriage have to do with my birth? Everything. The woman finally handed her the envelope. Read it when you are ready. Eleanor took it. What is inside? Proof. Of what? The woman looked at her for a long moment. That the Duke did not choose you by accident. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the envelope. What? The woman turned away. You believe he saw you pouring tea and simply fell in love. Eleanor said nothing. He chose you because your face reminded him of someone. Margaret? No. The woman looked back. Your mother. Eleanor stopped breathing. Richard knew? I don't know. Did his family? Some did. Who? The woman began walking toward the door. Eleanor followed. Wait. The woman stopped. Tell me who. She slowly turned. The Duchess. Eleanor stared. Richard's mother? She knew your mother. How? The woman hesitated. Because they were sisters. Eleanor's entire world seemed to tilt. What? But the woman had already opened the door. Wait. She disappeared into the evening mist. Eleanor ran after her. There was no one. Only the empty path. The trees. The fading light. And the sound of distant bells. Eleanor stood in the doorway, clutching the envelope. Her mother. The Duchess. Sisters. It made no sense. It could not possibly be true. And yet the crescent symbol was there. The locket. The brooch. The letters. Everything seemed to point toward the same hidden family. Eleanor returned to the chapel. She sat on the first wooden pew. Her hands trembled as she looked at the envelope. There was one name written on the front. Richard. Not Eleanor. Richard. She turned it over. The seal had been broken once, then carefully resealed. Someone had opened it before. Someone had read whatever was inside. Eleanor slowly broke the seal again. Inside was a letter. She unfolded it. The first sentence made her blood run cold. Asterisk Richard. If you are reading this, then Eleanor has finally discovered the truth. She stopped. The letter was addressed to him. But somehow, it had been waiting for her. She continued. Asterisk I know what you believe about Margaret. Asterisk you believe she betrayed our family. Asterisk you believe she abandoned Eleanor. Asterisk you believe the woman who disappeared 15 years ago is dead. Eleanor's hand covered her mouth. The next line was darker. Asterisk all three beliefs are false. She kept reading. Asterisk Margaret did not betray us. Asterisk she was betrayed. Eleanor's eyes blurred with tears. Then came the sentence that changed everything. Asterisk. And the woman you have been told was Eleanor's mother was never her mother at all. The letter slipped from her fingers. For several seconds, Eleanor simply stared at the floor. Her entire childhood seemed to collapse into one impossible question. If the woman she had called mother was not her mother, then who was? She reached for the letter again, but before she could continue, footsteps sounded outside the chapel. Slow, measured, approaching. Eleanor froze. Someone was coming. She folded the letter quickly. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. A shadow appeared across the threshold. Eleanor stood. Who's there? No answer. The shadow remained. Then a man's voice spoke from the darkness. Miss Harrow. Eleanor's blood turned cold. She knew that voice. She had heard it once before, in Richard's father's study, on the night she had remembered from childhood. The door began to open, and Eleanor finally understood why the old secrets had remained buried for so many years. Because the person standing outside that chapel was the last person she had expected to see. The door opened slowly. Eleanor did not move. She stood in the center of the abandoned chapel, the old letter pressed tightly against her chest. The man remained in the doorway. For several seconds, the fading light behind him made it impossible to see his face. Only his silhouette was visible. Tall, still, familiar. Then he stepped forward. Eleanor's breath caught. It was Mr. Harcourt, the Wexford family's solicitor, the man who had served Richard's father for more than 20 years, the man Eleanor had seen at Wexford House only a few days earlier. He closed the chapel door behind him. You shouldn't have come here. Eleanor stared at him. You knew. His expression remained controlled. Knew what? Don't. Her voice trembled. Not anymore. Mr. Harcourt looked at the envelope in her hand. So you've read it, part of it. Then you understand why you must leave. I understand nothing. He sighed. That is precisely what I feared. Eleanor stepped closer. You knew my mother. He did not answer. You knew Margaret. Still nothing. You knew my father. His eyes lowered. And you knew the truth about me. The solicitor looked at her. Yes. The word was almost inaudible, but it struck her harder than a shout. Eleanor's eyes filled. How long? All your life. She turned away. For a moment, she could not speak. The chapel seemed impossibly large around her. Cold stone, empty pews, dust suspended in the fading light. All the places where she had once believed her past was safely buried now seemed to be opening their doors. Why didn't anyone tell me? Because your father believed the truth would kill you. That is what everyone says. It was not a metaphor. Eleanor turned sharply. What does that mean? Mr. Harcourt looked toward the old altar. Your birth created a problem. What problem? A legal one. She frowned. An inheritance. He nodded. But not merely money. What else could there be? A title. Eleanor stared. Mr. Harcourt continued. Your father's marriage was not as simple as you were led to believe. My father was married to my mother. Yes. Then what are you saying? I am saying that before your father married the woman you knew as your mother, he had already made another promise. Eleanor's face went pale. To Margaret? No. Then who? He hesitated. To the Wexford family. She felt a chill. What promise? That his first child would belong to them. Eleanor could barely breathe. That makes no sense. It will. He reached inside his coat and removed a folded document. The Wexfords had been protecting a particular inheritance for generations. What inheritance? An estate in Cornwall. That is all. No. He looked at her. The title attached to it. Eleanor frowned. I don't understand. Neither did your father at first. Mr. Harcourt placed the document on the altar. The inheritance could only pass through a particular bloodline. Eleanor stared at him. And I was part of that bloodline. Yes. How? He remained silent. Eleanor's voice became sharper. How? Because your mother was not the woman you believed. She closed her eyes. The woman's face from the old photograph appeared in her mind. Margaret. Then the Duchess. 2 women. 1 secret. 1 child. Who was my real mother? Mr. Harcourt looked at her. Margaret. The word echoed through the chapel. Eleanor shook her head. No, she was. No, Miss Harrow. No, she backed away. Margaret died before I was born. No, but everyone said. They wanted everyone to believe it. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. Then where is she, Mr. Harcourt said nothing. Where is my mother? His silence answered before his words did. Alive. Wilt. Eleanor's knees nearly failed her. She caught the edge of a pew. Where? Why, I don't know. You expect me to believe that? I have not seen her in 15 years, but you know she is alive. Yes. How? Because I helped hide her. Eleanor stared at him. You? Why, I was young then. You helped my father. Yes. Why? Because I believed him. And now, Mr. Harcourt looked toward the chapel window. Now I believe I was wrong. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. A branch struck the broken window. Eleanor flinched. The sound seemed enormous in the silence. Tell me everything. I cannot. You can. No. Then I will find someone who will. Mr. Harcourt gave her a tired smile. You have your mother's determination. Eleanor's expression hardened. Don't compare me to her. Why? Because I don't know her. He looked at her with something close to pity. You know more of her than you think. He took the document from the altar. There is a room beneath Wexford House. Eleanor stared. What room? An old archive. Richard doesn't know about it. I doubt it. What is inside? Records. Of what? Births. Her heart stopped. Mine? Among others. How do I find it? You shouldn't. How? He hesitated. Behind the portrait of the first Duke. Eleanor remembered the hidden compartment at Ashcombe. There's another? Yes. Why didn't you tell Richard? Because the room was sealed after Margaret disappeared. Who sealed it? His father. Eleanor stepped closer. Why? Mr. Harcourt's voice dropped. Because something was found inside. What? He looked directly into her eyes. A second birth certificate. Eleanor went completely still. For me? No. Then whose? He hesitated. Richard's. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Richard was waiting outside the chapel. He had seen Harcourt enter. He had remained hidden among the trees. Now he watched the solicitor emerge alone. Richard stepped from the shadows. Harcourt. The older man stopped. Your Grace, you lied to me. Harcourt lowered his eyes. I did. Why? Because your father ordered me to. Richard's jaw tightened. My father is dead. I know. Then why obey him? Harcourt looked toward the chapel. Because some promises survive the people who make them. Richard stared. What did you tell Eleanor? Enough. That is not an answer. Harcourt sighed. She knows Margaret is alive. Richard's face changed. Alive? Yes. Where? I don't know. Richard grabbed his arm. You had better start remembering. Harcourt did not resist. She was moved. By whom? Your father. Where? To the north. Richard released him. The north? Yorkshire. Richard's eyes narrowed. What place? Harcourt shook his head. I was never told. Then how do you know? Because I delivered the carriage. Richard went silent. You saw her. Once. When? The night she disappeared. Was she alive? Harcourt looked at him. Yes. Richard's face went pale. What did she say? Harcourt's expression softened. She asked me to protect you. Richard swallowed. Why? She said that if anything happened to her, you would be the only person who could protect Eleanor. Richard looked toward the chapel. Eleanor doesn't know. She will. Not if I can help it. Harcourt shook his head. You cannot keep her in ignorance anymore. Richard stared at him. Why? Because someone else knows. Who? Harcourt hesitated, then whispered, Your mother. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Inside the chapel, Eleanor was waiting. She had heard voices outside. She knew Richard was there. When he entered, she looked at him. He could see immediately that she had been crying. He walked toward her. What happened? She shook her head. Your solicitor knows everything. Richard closed his eyes. Harcourt, he told me my mother is alive. Richard stopped. For a moment, he could not speak. Then he said, I know. Eleanor stared at him. You know? I just found out. You were outside. Yes. You heard him. Yes. How long? Eleanor. How long? He looked at her. Minutes. She turned away. You should have told me. I was trying to protect you. Everyone is trying to protect me. Her voice cracked. And everyone keeps lying. Richard stepped closer. I wasn't lying. You didn't tell me. I didn't know. She turned. Do you believe my mother is alive? Yes. Do you believe Margaret is my mother? He hesitated. I don't know. She held up the letter. It says she is. Then we need proof. She stared at him. You don't believe it? I believe the letter exists. That isn't what I asked. Richard came closer. I believe you. She looked at him. I don't know what else to believe. He reached for her hand. This time, she allowed him. I will find her. Eleanor's eyes filled again. You promise? I promise, she whispered. Then we find her before the wedding. Richard nodded. Before the wedding. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. They returned to Ashcombe that night. Neither spoke much during the journey. The moon had risen by the time they reached the estate. The house was dark. Almost every window had gone black. But one light remained. The library. Richard stopped. I didn't leave anyone there. Eleanor looked at him. Neither did I. They entered quietly. The door was unlocked. The room smelled of extinguished candles. The journal was gone. Eleanor stopped. Richard, he saw the empty desk. His face hardened. Someone has been here. The hidden box was open. The letters were scattered. The journal had disappeared. But something else remained. A white envelope placed carefully in the center of the desk. Eleanor approached. Her name was written on it. She opened it. Inside was a single sheet. Asterisk, you are looking in the wrong house. Eleanor read the next line. Asterisk. The truth was never buried at Ashcombe. Another line. Asterisk. It was buried at Wexford. Richard took the letter. At the bottom was a date. The date of Eleanor's birth. And beneath it, the crescent symbol. Richard looked at her. We go back, ma'am. Eleanor nodded. But not tonight. Why? Me. She looked toward the dark windows. Because whoever wrote this knows where we are, ma'am. A silence followed. Then came a sound. 3 soft knocks, from somewhere inside the house. Eleanor froze. Richard reached for the pistol beneath his coat. The knocking came again. 3 times. Slow, patient, from behind the wall. Richard looked toward the library fireplace. Eleanor whispered, There's someone behind there. Me. He moved toward the fireplace. There was no visible door, only stone. He pressed his hand against the wall. Nothing. Then he noticed a small crescent carved into the wood. 3 stars beneath it. He pressed it. A mechanism clicked. The stone shifted. A narrow passage opened behind the fireplace. Cold air flowed into the library. Eleanor stared into the darkness. Richard raised the candle. Stone steps descended beneath the house. A hidden passage, one that neither of them had known existed. Richard looked at Eleanor. Stay here, ma'am. She shook her head. No, Eleanor, you promised. He understood. She would not be left behind again. Together they descended. The passage was narrow, damp. The walls were covered with old stone. Their footsteps echoed. After several minutes, they reached a wooden door. Richard opened it. Beyond it was a small room. Shelves lined the walls. Old documents filled them. Boxes, ledgers, birth records, marriage certificates, death records, and on the center table, a single cradle. Eleanor stopped. Her face went pale. A child's blanket lay inside, yellowed with age. Beside it was a silver bracelet, tiny, made for a newborn. Eleanor approached. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up. Engraved on the inside were 3 words. Eleanor Margaret Ashford. She stared. Richard stepped closer. Eleanor, she looked at him. Why does my bracelet have Margaret's name? He had no answer. Then Eleanor noticed something beneath the cradle. A wooden box. She opened it. Inside was a birth certificate. She unfolded it. The name of the child was Eleanor Margaret Ashford, but the father's name had been scratched away. The mother's name was still visible. Margaret Ashford. Eleanor's breath caught. For a moment, Everything became painfully clear. Margaret was her mother, the woman she had mourned without ever knowing why, the woman who had supposedly disappeared, the woman who had been hidden from her. But there was something else. At the bottom of the certificate was a second signature, a witness. Eleanor read it, then stopped. Richard saw her expression. What? She handed him the certificate. His face went white. The witness was not Eleanor's father. It was his mother, the Duchess of Wexford. Richard looked at Eleanor. No. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. She was there. He shook his head. My mother witnessed your birth. Yes. Then she knew. Yes. Richard stepped back. The room suddenly felt too small. Then a sound came from behind them, a lock turning. They both turned. The door slammed shut. Eleanor rushed toward it. Richard. He tried the handle. Locked. From the other side. Someone had trapped them inside. Then, through the thick wooden door, came a woman's voice. Calm, cold, familiar. You should have listened when I told you to leave. Eleanor froze. The Duchess. Richard stared at the door. Mother. A pause. Then the voice answered. No. The candle in Richard's hand trembled. Eleanor looked at him. Who is that? The voice spoke again. And this time, Eleanor recognized it. It was the woman from the chapel, the woman in the veil. The Duchess is not the person you should fear. Silence. Then the woman whispered, because she is not your enemy. The door remained locked. Eleanor looked down at the birth certificate. Her hands were shaking. The woman continued from the other side. Your real enemy has been sitting beside you all this time. Eleanor slowly turned toward Richard. He looked horrified. What does that mean? No answer came. Instead, a small piece of paper slid beneath the door. Eleanor picked it up. There were only 4 words. Look behind the cradle. She turned. Richard lifted the cradle. Beneath it was another compartment. Inside lay a portrait. Eleanor pulled it out. It showed 3 women. Margaret, the Duchess, and a third woman, a woman Eleanor had never seen before. But the third woman's face was unmistakable. She looked exactly like Eleanor, and beneath the portrait was a date. The same date as Eleanor's birth. Richard stared at the image, then whispered. There were 2 children. Eleanor looked at him. What? He pointed to the portrait. 2 cradles. Her eyes moved toward the dark corner of the room. And there, hidden beneath an old cloth, was another cradle. Empty. Waiting. As if someone had taken the second child away. And suddenly Eleanor understood. The mystery had never been about who her mother was. It was about who had been born beside her, and why one child had been allowed to live as Eleanor Harrow, while the other had disappeared without a name. For several seconds, neither Eleanor nor Richard spoke. The second cradle stood before them in the dim light. Empty, dust-covered, waiting. Eleanor could not take her eyes from it. 2 children, she whispered. Richard stared at the portrait. That means someone was born with you. Someone who was taken away. He nodded slowly. But why? Eleanor looked down at the birth certificate. Because whoever that child was, they were important. A faint sound came from the passage behind them. Both turned. Nothing. Richard raised the candle. The corridor remained empty. Then Eleanor noticed something on the floor, a small silver button. She picked it up. There was a crest engraved upon it, the Wexford crest. Richard's expression changed. That wasn't here before. Eleanor looked toward the passage. Someone has been down here. Richard nodded. And they may still be nearby. They moved quickly toward the hidden door. But when Richard reached it, he stopped. The door was already open. The corridor beyond was empty. Whoever had been there was gone. Eleanor stepped outside. The library was silent. The fire had burned low, but on the desk lay something that had not been there before. A folded sheet of paper. Richard picked it up. His face became pale as he read. What does it say? He slowly handed it to Eleanor. Only one sentence had been written. Your sister is alive. Eleanor's fingers began to tremble. She looked at Richard. My sister? He said nothing. Beneath the sentence was another line. She has been watching you. Eleanor's heart began pounding, and then she saw the final words. She will come for you before the wedding." The candle flame flickered. Somewhere outside, a carriage moved along the distant road. Eleanor walked toward the window. Through the darkness, she could just make out its silhouette. The carriage stopped beyond the gates. A woman stepped down. She wore a pale dress, and even from that distance, Eleanor knew the face. Her own face. The woman looked directly toward the house. Then she smiled and disappeared into the darkness. Eleanor stood frozen. Richard came beside her. "Did you see her?" She nodded. "Yes." "Who was she?" Eleanor whispered. "My sister." And with that realization, the world Eleanor thought she knew was gone forever, because the woman who had been missing for all these years was no longer missing. She had found Eleanor, and she was coming home. But whether she had returned as a sister or as an enemy was a question that would have to wait. Because the wedding was approaching. The secrets were beginning to surface. And somewhere in the darkness beyond Wexford House, someone was preparing to reveal the final truth about the two daughters born on the same night. Thank you for staying with us through this chapter of Eleanor's story. If you are enjoying this historical drama, please take a quiet moment to subscribe to *** Dramatic History ***. It is a new channel, and your support truly helps us continue telling these forgotten stories. If you enjoyed this episode, leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and share the story with someone who loves historical romance, mystery, and dramatic storytelling. And don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you won't miss what comes next. Because this story is far from over. *** Part 3 will be coming very soon. Until then, good night.